Sports and Society is made possible through the generous support of Philosophy Lab Corporation. Philosophy Lab, where we seek to discover new ways of organizing, presenting, experiencing, and discovering information to enhance our lives. Contact Philosophy Lab for customized educational materials. Our email is hello@philosophylab.com. Sports and Society is produced by Philosophy Lab in cooperation with the Ethics Center at the University of South Florida, the host of The Summit, the first international conference on ethics and sports. This time on Sports and Society, sports and equal opportunity, Title IX and gender equity in sports.
Most of what goes on in sport goes on off the playing field.
It's about what you have on them in order to protect yourself.
I was first raped violently.
Well, you're finished. You'll never play football again.
Obviously, shoe contracts worth $400,000 or $500,000.
Morals and ethics don't exist above and beyond the society that they're a part of.
Nowadays, kids are faced with the choice of do you want a couple of $1 million or your college degree?
Sport is a metaphor for what goes on in the real world.
What is Title IX, and how should it be applied in sports? The United States has a law, Title IX, which requires that publicly funded sports programs not discriminate on the basis of gender regarding sports opportunities. Such a simple ethical principle that men and women should be treated equally may seem both obvious and innocuous. But the actual management of the law has a number of practical as well as theoretical stumbling blocks. What are the ethical and managerial issues associated with achieving gender justice in sports programs in schools and colleges? How are and how should these decisions be made? These issues were raised at the Sports Summit on Sports Ethics. So let's listen, and while you're watching, evaluate the strength of the arguments and the appropriateness of the viewpoints being given.
Let me use my 5 minutes to talk a little bit about the moral equation, and maybe a simple story will suffice. You are parents, and your first child is a male. And you do what most parents try to do. You try to give your child everything he wants. And pretty soon his room becomes a palace of athletics privilege. He has balls and gloves and hockey sticks and every sports implement known to man and womankind. Every summer he goes to 2 or 3 different sports camps. He is a privileged child when it comes to athletics. Somewhat later, your spouse gets pregnant, and the second child is a girl. Your income does not change. Your income does not change, and she wants to play sports too. Well, it seems that parents would have 3 choices under those circumstances. 1, you can kill your last born. If one assumed you wanted to give the same opportunity to your daughter as your son. You could kill your last born, or when your last born comes to the table or comes to ask for some athletic equipment, you can say, no, you can only eat half, or get half, or in some way get less. Or you could bring the family around the table and say, hey, my son is as important as my daughter, and giving her the same opportunity to play is just as important. And we're going to figure out how to do this. And maybe the family has to tighten its belt. Maybe we're not going to go away for spring or summer vacation. Maybe my son is going to have to go to 1 summer camp, and my daughter is going to have to go to 1 summer camp, but somehow we would figure out how to treat our children equally. And that ultimately is the moral requirement of Title IX, and that is where we have failed. I blame this failure on an absence of leadership. Moms and dads in colleges and universities are not doing a very good job of treating their children equally.
People outside this room do not know what Title IX is and how it is being enforced, or even its unintended consequences. But I am here to tell you that it is denying our children sports opportunity, the ability to participate, and access to higher education. Today, Title IX, utilizing destructive blunt quotas, is undeniably causing net losses of tens of thousands of opportunities in our schools. In the process of dictating outcomes, it is inevitable that educational areas where females are the majority will be discriminated against as Title IX quota-based equity is turned on them. The drive for proportionality on college campuses and high schools, athletic participation that mirrors the split between women and men in the student body as a whole, is resulting in few gains for women and significant losses for men. Schools are increasingly being presented with the choice of artificially inflating their women's participation or finding ways to cut the number of men who compete. Tragically, budget pressures are forcing them to choose the latter option. NCAA data provided in their 1997 gender equity study show that member institutions have on the average, eliminated over 10% of their male opportunities in the last 5 years, a loss of 20,896 male athletes with a corresponding gain of just 5,816 female athletes.
There has also been a public, as well as supposed educational leadership, acceptance of an economic justification for discrimination. That it's perfectly right, it's perfectly acceptable to argue that we're going to kill football, or somehow football is going to be unduly distressed if you transfer resources from the men's program to the women's program. And somehow this should justify breaking the law. The equivalent would be if my son or a daughter were wheelchair bound and a school refused to build a ramp up to a classroom, me accepting the argument that, well, goodness gracious, we're going to hurt the football team if I spend my money building this ramp. You know, we'd no more accept that than a man on the moon, and yet we're willing to accept that in the case of athletics. I think we're also willing to accept, talking about moral justice, we're also willing to accept punishment and retribution against those who stand up and ask for equality. That we have fired coaches. We have made the lives of students who bring lawsuits or even question, whether or not they're being treated equally miserable on college campuses. Coaches have taken their teams to women's games to harass, women who have advanced the need for gender equity. We have been guilty of lesbian baiting in attacking coaches and those who are standing up for Title IX, and it's unfathomable to me that this is acceptable, and it is acceptable because we've done little or nothing about it. And with great sympathy for both the swimming coaches and the wrestling coaches, we have thought nothing of the fact that we're pitting the have-nots against the have-nots. That we're cutting men's minor sports, and we're making him blame Title IX, and we're making him blame women instead of, who is to blame. It's the maintenance of an economic construct that supports the continuation of football at all costs, or the continuation of basketball on some campuses at all costs, even at the cost of social justice and adherence to the law. That is the moral dilemma.
There's over 2 million more women participating in non-athletic extracurricular activities than men. And I think that if we want to talk about the proportionality rule, we need to look at how that's going to apply across the board. If we're willing to cut men's sports to achieve proportionality, then we need to be able to look across and see what happens when we go into these other extracurricular activities. And I think, where I'm coming from is that it needs to reflect interest and ability, and things have been hurt. Programs have been hurt. One of the things that, and I'm not going to get into them now, but I want to talk about what's happening at the college level and what solutions have been reached. I'm just a swimming coach. It's not up for me to define what the issues are, but I can tell you what people have done. I'm just going to give you one case. Joan Domitz, who's the swimming coach at the University of Wisconsin at Whitewater, coaches both men and women. They had a policy there that gender equity was described as you had to have 5 more women on your team than you had men. Solutions come to the surface. Men's sports don't have to be cut.
And let's understand from day one that Title IX does not require the dropping of any opportunity for any male athlete, period, end of story. So to blame Title IX for an institutional decision to screw male swimmers or male wrestlers is absolutely inaccurate, and it's unfair. It is people who are choosing not to cut the pie into smaller pieces so that all kids can play. It is an anathema to choose to cut opportunities as a method of complying with any federal law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of gender. Take the analogy. You're in the middle of a corporation. You're the president of a corporation. You get sued for discrimination on the basis of salaries. You're paying your female employees less than men. Now, you don't solve that problem by telling all of your male employees that they're going to take 50% salary cuts so that you can give the women the same level of salary. You bring the disadvantaged up to the level of the advantaged. You don't treat the advantaged wrestlers and swimmers like the disadvantaged by removing opportunities from them. So this is a failure of nerve on the part of college presidents, athletic directors, and you are being suckered into blaming women and blaming Title IX instead of blaming that failure of nerve for taking opportunities away from men. And it's that simple.
The ethical challenge of providing men and women equal opportunity to participate in sport has several aspects which must be considered, and each has its own set of managerial problems which, when taken together, present us with important management as well as ethics issues. Donna Lopiano presented the analogy of a family transitioning from a single-child household to a two-child household, where it is only fair that if the income of the family remained constant, the per-child expenditure would change, and some sacrifices somewhere would have to be made. Thus, the old traditions and management choices developed when there was only one child are not appropriate now that they have two children. So too must colleges and universities change their old ways now that women have joined in the athletic competition. But the question arises, what should change, and how should those changes be made? Michael Copperthite addresses the trend over the last 5 years, which has seen a loss of over 20,000 male athletes and a gain of less than 6,000 female athletes on college campuses. And he attributes this loss to Title IX. He is committed to increasing athletic opportunities for all, but he sees the trade-off of 20,000 men for 6,000 women being as going in the wrong direction. Bob Groseth points out that women might not participate in athletics as much as men, but women do participate in collegiate extracurricular activities far more than men. He suggests that equal participation opportunities in sports should be determined only with respect to providing an equal number of opportunities for women interested in participating in sports, as there are opportunities for men interested in participating in sports. We will consider further the idea of equal participation for men and women being based upon equal interests in sports. And we will consider how the present proportionality rule became the dominant interpretation of Title IX, and we will consider some of the ethical and management issues related to implementing equal opportunity in sports participation.
Opposing policies of social justice is not a routine matter for colleges and universities in the country. If you think about it, they are the vanguard of our thinking and action about social justice. As a large part of the population today is prepared to eliminate affirmative action, our colleges are fighting tooth and nail to preserve it. When Title IX was enacted in 1972, they quickly changed admissions policies to be sex-blind, and single-sex institutions suddenly became coeducational. They changed employment practices. But with respect to athletics, for various historical reasons that I'll pass over, they differ with the government as to what it means to comply with the law, which says simply that thou shalt not discriminate, quote, on the basis of sex, end of quote. If you read the interpretation that has burdened colleges, and probably only with a couple of aspirin would you want to try it, you will see the struggle of some young lawyers in 1979 in a rather little-known office of the then Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, trying to figure out how you would describe equal opportunity when, by consensus, the opportunities are going to be segregated. You've all heard the language from the famous Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, which said, quote, that separate but equal facilities are inherently unequal. Now, even though that's a solecism, if you look at it literally, it's now widely accepted in our society that in employment and in housing and in many other instances, we don't tolerate the notion that opportunities are segregated. We demand equal access to whatever single good is in question. But in athletics, we've decided for good and sufficient reasons that we will segregate the opportunities. Men and women in general, with a few exceptions, will not compete on the same teams. So we've set up a much more difficult problem for ourselves, and that is what has drawn my interest to it, because it's a problem of distributive justice.
I'm 51 years old. I was around when the regs were developed for Title IX. As a matter of fact, it was in a meeting in Joe Califano's office when representatives of the AIAW, the Women's Athletic Governance Organization at the time, confronted the representatives of the NCAA and the football coaches-to-be, and the whole issue of how is one going to define equal participation opportunity came up. And the suggestion from one side of the table, all the women in the room, was there's only one simple way to do this, and that is the standard should be equal per capita expenditures. If you acknowledge that women aren't interested in the same sports as men, if you acknowledge the fact that sports cost different things, you really get into a can of worms. If you talk about interest, if you talk about how much it costs to outfit a football player, why don't we just do equal per capita expenditures? However women want to use their money and however many opportunities are derived from that money, that's fine, and the same thing for men. The men on the other side of the table had an absolute heart attack. Because why? They had 100% of the money and the women had none, and the whole idea of splitting the pie in half was an anathema, to say the least. So they came up, and people don't believe this, the NCAA and college football coaches at the time came up with a three-part test. Not Congress, not these functionaries of government. The NCAA proposal was very simple. They suggested proportionality as the mathematical test for one reason. What was the proportion of male and female in the student body in the 1970s, early 1970s? 60% male and 40% female. And what they intended to do fully was to license permanent advantage in terms of participation in numbers in athletics. Second, the weakest civil rights test on the books has to be this notion, the second part of the three-part test, which is that you have to prove you're trying. Can you prove that every 1 or 2 years you've added a sport for the underrepresented sex? And what the guys sitting there really felt was, hey, if we have no timeline, if nobody tells us we have to do this tomorrow, over the next 10 years, we can do equality. We just have to add one sport every 10 years. Heck, this is going to be easy. And then the third piece was, hey, we know that girls aren't as interested in sports as boys, and when we start adding sports, guess what? They're not going to come out. And that's the origin of the three-part test. It's not functionaries, it wasn't women, it was a group of people who intended to legislate a weak civil rights law and permanent advantage on the part of men's sports.
My goal here is to try to frame this as something other than a male versus female issue, because I don't believe it is. I've tried to figure out why the wrestling coaches and swimming coaches and all other non-revenue men's coaches have not linked arms and marched on the American Football Coaches Association, the NCAA, with advocates of women's sports, quite simply because of the football model. I'll give you a little idea of what football sucks out of academia today, and Lewis very briefly glossed over football. And I happen to believe that addressing football, the excesses of football, is something of a magic bullet in this whole thing. The amounts of money that are spent to maintain big-time football programs, and most Division I football programs do not make money. The vast majority do not make money, so that is a myth that they are the economic engines for most Division I schools. The Learjets that are used to fly and to pay visits to recruits, however many times those flights take place, are not dollars that are doing any educating. Coaches insist on taking their teams and putting them in hotels on Friday nights because they need to focus for the big game on Saturday. Fall practice will begin well before the fall starts, before dorms are open and dining halls are open. Huge amounts of money.
I would warn against generalizing. There are many Division I football teams that profit greatly, and there are many that don't. So let's talk about teams that are self-sustaining, whether they're male or female. The Tennessee women's basketball team reportedly is self-sustaining, and there may be others in the future. A self-sustaining team is not drawing money from the subsidy pie. It's making the pie. So I think the answer to your opening question about why through the 20th century, particularly since television, that coaches like Coach Groseth are not complaining about the football team is that they do understand that that team and the basketball team, those are the only two at the moment, are in an entertainment market where they're benefiting from the public's interest in watching those sports. And the revenues that come in, both in gate receipts and television, are an accident of our society. If we were discussing this in the United Kingdom, we would be talking about football, but it would mean soccer. And we wouldn't even have revenue-producing basketball. We have to overcome the temptation to envy here when the laborer is paid vastly less than the investment banker. We allow inequalities in our society on the belief that, and I'm referring to Rawls again, that in a capitalist economy, if people are given incentives to be able to make a lot of money, that will produce a healthier economic result for the poorest than if we legislated equality. We do have football living high on the hog. That's been true for decades. Yes, they stay in hotels the night before games. They travel on chartered planes. They stay in good hotels. Their coaches are numerous and well paid, and they have enormous budgets for training and recruiting and the like. And if they need a new building, they build one. That isn't news. It didn't originate at the time of Title IX. It hasn't been the source of grief with respect to men's non-revenue sports, because they understand two things. First, that any sport that is self-sustaining is not drawing money away from them. Secondly, if it is self-sustaining and it's producing some of their subsidy pie, and if they decide in a sort of penny-wise, pound-foolish way to reduce that budget, maybe you don't need the new weight room, they say. Or how about getting by with 11 coaches instead of 12? If that causes them to lose a couple recruits, and they lose maybe 1 or 2 games, and if that means the difference between a non-Alliance Bowl and an Alliance Bowl invitation, nowadays, as you well know, that's about a $7 million swing right there. And the teams that will be hurt by that are the non-revenue teams, men's or women's.
I mean, if you look at the television ratings, if you look at really making big money, what are the women's sports you would choose? You would pay $250,000 or $500,000 to get Bella Caroli to come to be the coach of gymnastics at my school, and I'd make sure every school in my conference sponsored gymnastics, or I'd get Christy Yamaguchi and Michelle Kwan and Tara Lipinski, and I'd pay big money to get Dorothy Hamill or Peggy Fleming as their coaches, and darn it, I can do the same thing that football does. But the fact of the matter is we're having people talking out of both sides of their mouth. Somehow, football is the only one that is allowed to create this investment of resources in order to be a moneymaker. And then, whether it's wrestling or swimming or women's sports, they're criticized as not being worthy, even though that similar investment has not been made. Something is wrong with this picture. There are double standards going on here. Double standards in terms of market, double standards in terms of women having to prove their interest when men have never had to prove their interest. So it's a sad state of affairs.
In what sense should we mean equal opportunity? Equal numbers? Equal money? Equal money relative to numbers of people interested, or some other definition? Each sense of equality may have different legal and moral management consequences. Following Louis Jenin, we would measure the numbers of men and women interested in participating in sports and then equalize the relative participation. However, even this approach to equality might not provide an answer regarding the fairness issues raised with respect to equal expenditures of money, either per participant or per gender. Bob Groseth is in agreement with Louis Jenin when he argues that Title IX and gender equity issues should not solely be framed as a male-female conflict, but should be framed as an economic haves versus have-nots conflict. Here the issue is one of fairness relative to the money raised and the money spent, and the women's and men's non-revenue sports, the so-called Olympic sports, are on the same footing and in the same dangers of budget cuts. It is with respect to the sports budget that Donna Lopiano argues that there has been a failure of leadership in athletic departments and institutions of higher learning. The failure of leadership to provide the money necessary to achieve the benefits that sports brings to everyone who participates, and the failure to make those benefits available equally to men and women. Title IX and gender equity provides a wealth of issues for the ethicist and the manager alike. Issues of equality and discrimination apply to race, ethnic, national origin, and religious aspects of society. And we know how society has found these issues very difficult to manage. So why would we expect sports to be any easier? Have you faced issues concerning equal opportunity in sports? You are invited to share your experiences and your views with us at the Virtual Summit Conference on Sports being held at www.philosophylab.com. This program is one in a series of programs on sports and society, which is a college telecourse. There are 2 accompanying books to the series: Exploring Sports and Society, The Essential Companion, and Sports and Society, Readings and Conversations. Both are published by Kendall Hunt Publishing Company. All sports and society materials are available by calling Philosophy Lab at 727-824-6053 or email info@philosophylab.com.